There have been a number of events in recent years demonstrating that climate change is in fact beginning to have an effect on people's human rights. One of them would be, for example, the cyclone that hit the Philippines in November 2013. It recorded the fastest speeds ever recorded for a cyclone. One of the effects of a warming climate is to cause more intense cyclones and hurricanes than we've had in the past. We've been very slow to move on climate change. We've known about it for 20, 30 years. There's simply been an inability to bring down our greenhouse gas emissions. They're increasing as we speak, year on year. A lot of people have begun to look for other ways to think and talk about this problem, partly just to motivate the political process, partly to find other legal tools that might be effective. Climate change begins life as a scientific problem. In fact, it begins as a meteorological problem. Having started with science, we then moved into other areas of life, a first obvious place being economics. And from there to the social sciences. So people begin to ask, well, how does it affect societies and people's ordinary lives? This sort of lag, this time lag from the early climate science through to the later social science partly explains why nobody was really thinking about the human rights consequences of climate change.
Traditionally, human rights law hasn't been thought to have much to say about the environment. The seminal human rights treaties didn't address the environment because they came before the modern environmental movement. Even as late as the early 2000s, it was still, let's say, an unusual type of argument to make at the United Nations.
I was talking to people who had no idea that climate change was actually affecting people and almost didn't want to know. Climate change was about melting glaciers and polar bears, and these were the icons. And it was very scientific and it was very abstract. And it was not affecting them because they didn't see it.
So there's at least two ways in which we might think about climate change as posing a problem to the basic access to human rights. The first is simple climate change impacts. Sea levels rise, fresh water disappears, food stops being produced.
Climate change is a threat to human rights such as rights to life, health, water, food, because it undermines the ability of people to be able to enjoy those rights.
At the second level, in order to deal with climate change, we need to stop using certain kinds of energy. 1 billion people in the world today don't have access to basic energy. And what we're basically telling them is, well, we have this wonderful, cheap, accessible source of energy that made us all rich, and you're not going to get it. Now, clearly that's a problem. My approach to climate change has to do with my experience in the late 1990s, based in Dakar, Senegal. Climate change was all about development, and development was all about raising basic standards of living, ensuring people had basic access to water, food, healthcare, all of which are being affected directly by climate change. At the time, there was really a single intervention drawing attention to the human rights dimensions of climate change in the form of a case.
The Inuit brought a case against the United States, essentially arguing that the United States had violated their human rights by not doing more to combat climate change. That was a bit of a false start because the Inter-American Commission didn't take the case. However, it raised people's awareness that this was a possible line of argument.
The case put the human rights question in climate change on the map.
2 years later, a group of small island states met in Male, the capital of the Maldives, and adopted something known as the Male Declaration. In 2008, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution to that effect, and they, as part of their process, held consultations at which they invited experts of various kinds. And when I got to that meeting, on every chair there was a copy of a book called Climate Change and Human Rights, A Rough Guide. So this was my introduction to Stephen. But there was only a few of us really that were kind of looking at this issue. Stephen had already produced this rather detailed analysis of the issue, so it came at the perfect time to be influential in the debate. the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights ended up reporting, yeah, you know what, climate change does adversely affect human rights. And really from that point on, the Human Rights Council has kind of remained seized of that issue.
In my work in Realising Rights, I had a close link with the International Council on Human Rights Policy, and I became aware that they were working on a policy paper that Stephen Humphreys was leading on, and that would be the first time that somebody would write something about human rights and climate change. And as I read the text, I realised Stephen's right. This is a huge human rights issue as he has framed it, and we must get that message out. It became a well-known book and much-cited book because it opened people's eyes to the fact that this is not something that's happening in the future. It's happening now. And it's happening all over the world, but it's much worse for those who are least responsible. And that brought me to the word justice. The injustice of climate change is compelling. And it is just incredible how that whole agenda has changed. And people have really become aware of human rights. There are NGOs now who speak about climate justice. When civil society marches, it marches for climate justice all over the world. And business has begun to embrace climate justice.
It's gaining traction and gaining force right now as we speak. The negotiating text at the Paris 2015 negotiations includes a number of references to human rights as a motivating principle in future climate change policy.
A human rights perspective has helped inform the negotiations in large part by supporting efforts to have a 1.5 instead of a 2-degree target. I think it's actually been a success story.
We're definitely at a moment of crisis, which I think is much more pressing than people generally seem to realize. What we do have to hope, I think, is that the kind of movement that we've seen in the last few years, popular movements, gains momentum and begins to turn things around.
Any child born today will live right through the cycle of the impacts. But the quicker we get to a carbon-free world, the more likely they will have the jobs they want, the future they want, the health and the sense of living in a good world that is more equal.